Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to stream number 2. Hopefully you guys can hear me a little bit better. I did upgrade to my microphone, got it plugged in, and I got a separate monitor this time too, so I can keep an eye on the stream while I go through the tutorial here. So today we're going to be talking about After Effects. Going to be hosting a lower third workshop, kind of go over the basic controls and stuff inside After Effects. So if you're newer or brand new to the software, this is going to be a great workshop for you here today. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started. So I'm inside Adobe After Effects, and if you are used to other Premiere Pro, or InDesign, Photoshop, it works in panels very similar to the other Creative Cloud applications. There's different workspaces. So if you go to Window Workspace, there's a default workspace, which, to be honest, I use pretty much all the time unless I'm in a very specific mode. But there are other workspaces that you can explore. You can move these panels around, very similar to Premiere Pro. All right, so let's go over some of the most important panels if you are brand new to After Effects. So first and foremost, there's the project panel, and that's the panel that is right here, project panel. If you can't see one of the panels, you can always go up to Window Panel. And your main panels are down here, project right there. So the project panel, this holds all of the important information, whether you import a project or you import like files, media, whether it's graphics, videos, and different assets, they will live in the project panel. And you can also create bins and folders. For example, you can create a folder down here, and you can create, maybe an assets folder, and you can put your assets in there. To import files, you go to File, Import, File, and you can choose different graphics. In this workshop, we're not really going to work with any videos or external, files per se, but that's how you can import different media files. This also holds compositions, and compositions are essentially, the sequence. If you're working, if you're coming over from Premiere Pro, it's essentially the file that stores your, your design and your motion graphics or visual effects. In this case, the lower third. So, your assets, they live in the project panel, and down below is the timeline panel. So this is essentially, where you will be actually stacking your layers and starting to create your lower third. Then you have your composition panel, which is in the center here. This is actually visually where you can see, very similar to the program monitor inside Premiere Pro, where you can actually see what you're doing inside After Effects. Then to the right-hand side, you have a few important panels. One of them is the effects and presets, which we'll touch later, but after all, this is called After Effects, so all of the effects and different things are inside the effects and presets panel. And specifically for lower thirds, you'll be focusing on the character panel, which you can change fonts and different things, as well as the paragraph panel, where you can left justify, center justify it, and different things such as that. So that's the overview of the different panels. Now let's talk about the composition. So the composition is what you actually create and you actually start in. So to create a new composition, there's a few different ways you can do that. You first can go up to Composition, New Composition, and that's pretty much the easiest way. You can also click the New Composition button in the lower left-hand corner of the project panel as well. And you'll notice this window come up. So, first you have the composition name, so you can name it. So in this case, I'm just going to name it lower third. Then you have a few presets that you can choose from. You can change it from 1920 by 1080 to a different, 4K or different frame rates. Or you can also punch it in manually. So you can change this value by just clicking and typing. You can change the frame rate here. I would recommend keeping the pixel aspect ratio to square pixels unless you're working on a very unique format. Down below the start time code, I always usually leave it as 0. But what's important is the duration. So, if this says anything different other than 10 seconds, for lower thirds, honestly, I leave it at around 10 seconds. So that's good right there. This is pretty much all you really have to worry about in this case, but there is an advanced tab and a 3D renderer tab, and we won't really touch that today, but this is the basic settings that you'd want to set up. Essentially, comparing it to Premiere Pro, if you're creating a sequence, this is essentially your project, that your sequence or timeline, the settings of which that you're going to actually start designing your lower third on. So I'm going to click OK. All right, so now a few things have happened. You'll notice that we actually have a new item in the project panel, and that's the composition item. So this is its own thing. You can move this around. You can move this into that assets folder we just created. Now it's in there. You can rename this folder or this bin by right-clicking and going to rename, or clicking the return or enter key. I always like to make a comps folder, so that way all my compositions are in that one folder. And to the right, you'll notice that in the composition window, we now have a screen here, and yours might actually be black. You can toggle it by clicking this button down here called Toggle Transparency Grid. Now we'll show transparency or not show transparency. So when you click it, when it shows this, you can actually see through all the layers. So, for example, when you're designing lower thirds, you can actually see through it. You can actually see through it, and it's basically showing you like, hey, there's nothing actually in the background. It's just the lower third that is there, and you can actually see the see-through. Now, when it's like this, it's just showing a black background, but it still technically is transparent. And to kind of showcase how this actually works, what I'm going to do is actually create a new solid. So if you go to Layer, New Solid, and this is essentially kind of similar to like a black video, or just kind of like, the fill layer in Photoshop, if you will. It's just a solid color that you can really use just to fill the screen. In this case, I'm just going to leave it, magenta solid. Make comp size, that's important. And when you click the color, you can change the color. But say if we make it black, and you click OK, and you click OK on that window, if you toggle transparency now, you'll notice that nothing's there because there is actually a physical black background there. And this black solid, you can change it. If you go back to Layer, Solid Settings, you can change the color of it to red. And this is essentially just a layer that you can make different colors, and you can manipulate. You can add effects to this. And solids, you'll be working quite a bit inside After Effects. But yeah, now you'll notice when we toggle transparency, it's not there. But if we delete it and we toggle transparency, you can see through it. So that's essentially toggle transparency and how that works. All right, hi SL Tech School. Just checking in on the chat. Alrighty, let's start actually creating lower thirds. So up above, you'll notice that you have a tools panel. So there's the home button. Right now you have the selection tool, which is just shortcut V. And then you'll notice that there's the rectangle tool. And this, by default, you'll actually create a shape layer. You can see by the star here, it will create a shape if you click and drag into the composition panel. Now, one important note that I do want to cover before we start going over creating a lower third is there's two things that you want to keep in mind when you're creating graphics or lower thirds in general. One of which is if you have a list of names, I think it's just best practice to just keep in mind what is your longest name and kind of design to that. If you have a really long name, make sure the graphic you create can actually cover that name. The second thing is sometimes you want to animate right away, but a good rule of thumb is to actually just design the lower third first and then go back in and actually animate it once you have the actual look of how you want it to look first. So with that in mind, let's actually start designing the lower third. And in this case, I'm just going to use my name, or John the Video Guy, and content creator as like the subtitle for this example here. So To create a lower third, first in the composition panel, what you want to do is click on this button right here at the bottom and turn on title action safe. And this will actually bring up the title action safe. And this is important. That way, just in case if you're exporting this and putting it on a TV, your lower third doesn't accidentally get cut off on the edges of the side of the graphic. So the outside line is action safe and the inside graphic is title safe. So we want to focus on the inside graphic here. We want to make sure all text, graphics, and logos are within the inside graphic here. So to create a graphic, or using the rectangle tool here, we'll just click and drag to make a lower third. So we'll just click and drag in the composition panel and we'll create let go. And yours might look different, especially since I kind of played with some of my settings before this live stream. But to change the actual color and the different things, you'll notice that there's a few menus up above here. You notice that there's a fill button. So you can click on this and you have different fill options for your shape. So first you can have no shape, so you can just click that and you don't have a shape. Then there's actually a solid color, so you can click that and it just turns it into just a standard color. Or you can actually choose gradient, which what you saw before, where you can actually choose a gradient and you can have like two colors going into each other. And there's a linear and radial gradient. So in this example, I'm just going to use the gradient and kind of go with a blue color, since that is my favorite color. So I'm just going to click that and click OK. And you can change the colors by clicking on the right side and then changing the actual colors here. So you can change, this yellow to maybe a blue color. In this magenta color, I'm going to change it to maybe a darker blue. Something like that. Then click OK. So now we got that, but maybe we want to adjust the way it blends. Maybe we want to change the direction of it. Well, you have a few different options under the actual layer inside the timeline panel. So you notice down below a lot's happening here. We got this shape layer and you'll see this little drop icon. If we just click that, you'll notice that this is just one layer. And when we untwirl it, we have different things that we can change within this layer. And I'm just going to collapse this, that way we can kind of see what's going on here. So under contents, this is actually the contents of the actual shape. So this is actually the rectangle itself, the stroke, which we didn't actually change yet, but you notice that there's a red stroke on it. If I just click off here, you'll notice that there's a stroke. So if we untwirl stroke, you can actually change the color of the stroke in here by just clicking on the red. Change that. Now it's white. Very similar to going up above with the layer selected. Going up above, you can change the color up there as well. And you can turn off the stroke, very similar to the fill, by just clicking the none. In this case, I do want a stroke, so I'll just leave it on there. Well, I don't know. Let's turn off the stroke, since feeling no stroke today. So with the stroke off, we'll do that. And then under gradient fill, you'll notice that there's a start and end point. So this is where we can actually fine tune that gradient. We can actually change, the direction of it by changing the X and Y values. We can maybe put the dark below and the start point, or the lighter above a little bit. There we go. That kind of looks pretty cool. You got like the dark to the bottom left, and then you got the lighter color to the top right. So there's a lot of settings in here that you can play with. Just know that these are here and that you can actually change, the scale, position, and different things of the actual rectangle itself. And keyboard shortcut, if you just hit U, that kind of collapses everything and shows and unshows keyframes. All right, so now that we have this box, let's actually add some text now. So if we grab our text tool right up here, it's the T. By default, should be horizontal type tool. And then we can just click out into our project, into our composition panel. So when we click once, you'll notice that a line appears, and that in the timeline, you'll notice that we have an empty text layer in there. So we can just type out our name. So I'm just going to type out my name. All right. And then if you click off in the timeline panel, you'll notice that we have our text now. So when we click on it and we go back to our selection tool up above, we can actually click and drag to reposition it in the composition panel. So we can click and drag it kind of down here. And then this is where those panels come into play. So we can go up to our paragraph panel, and you'll notice it's center align right now, but we can always change it to left align. That kind of shifts it over a little bit, but we can just click and drag this back over. That way it's center aligned, or sorry, left align in the composition window. And we can go back into our character panel, and we can change the font if you want. In this case, I'm going to leave it as is, but you can change the font. Be like right there. John the video guy. Just drag that up a little bit. Now, one thing you'll notice, my name is pretty long, and maybe one thing we want to do is kind of expand the expand the shape a little bit. So what you can do is just click on that shape, kind of drag the sides of it, and then kind of hold down Shift and just slide it over a little bit, and then just keep dragging the sides until it covers the length of the name. We'll just slide my name over a little bit. I'm just clicking and dragging on it. That way we have something that looks like this. All right, so one thing when you're working in the timeline that I do want to mention if you're new to After Effects is it works in, the bottom layer is rendered first, right? That's what you see. And then the layer above it is stacked on top of it. So, if we take this layer and we put it under the shape layer, it's hidden. We'll just click and drag that back up, and you can remove these. You can move these around. And you'll notice to the right here, these are the actual layers. And, being a timeline, is showing the timeline over 10 seconds, which we set up earlier. The composition itself is 10 seconds long. But say if we click and drag this over, you'll notice that the text layer actually starts at 1 second now. If we play this back hitting our space bar, we have a rectangle and then our name appears. So you can click and drag this around. You can drag the edges of it to kind of, change how it's trimmed inside the actual timeline itself. You can make it longer, shorter for any of the layers. In this case, I'm just going to drag this back out here to the beginning. But just know that that's how you can change the different layers inside After Effects here. All right, so we got our name here. Let's add a title now. And to do that, I want to add a little maybe white box under the blue box here. And to do that, what I'm first going to do is actually select both of these by just clicking on one, holding down Shift, and select the other one. And when you click and drag, you're actually moving both of these layers together here. I'm just going to drag these up a little bit. You can also fine-tune your position by just using the arrow keys here. So I'm just kind of clicking one at a time. Let me put up my keycaster. That way you guys can see my arrow keys. There we go. So yeah, I'm just using my arrow keys to move the lower third around. All right, so let's, using what we learned so far, let's add another rectangle. So I'm just gonna get my rectangle tool. Before we draw it, I'm gonna set my settings. I'm gonna go to Fill, gonna go to Solid Color, click OK, then change it from black to white, click OK, and now let's drag another rectangle here. Cool, that looks good. Now, one thing here, we want to make sure that it's aligned to our, the left side of the lower third. And what you can do here is actually use the zoom tool. So if you go up to the zoom tool at the top of the tools bar, now it's a zoom tool. And what you can do is marquee select around the space you want to zoom in to, and it will zoom into that space. You can go back to your selection tool and fine tune this a little bit more. That way it's to the edge. You can just use your arrow keys to kind of move the rectangle over a little bit. And then another handy tool that you'll want to keep in mind is the hand tool. So you can click on the hand tool, keyboard shortcut is H, and you can actually click and drag around. And this way you can actually move around your composition here without destructing, the actual lower third itself. If you did that with the selection tool, you'd actually be moving everything. But the hand tool is a nice tool to just kind of move around your composition here. All right, so I'm going to go back to my selection tool. We'll add the text, so we'll just click on the type tool, and we'll just click over here into our composition window, and we'll type out, content creator. And then I'm just going to click once and then hit Command or Control A to select all of your text in that text layer. And we'll change maybe to black color. And you can always change, maybe stick with the same font, but for titles specifically, I always like to go to maybe a little less intense, thick font, maybe regular or maybe even medium. Just go to medium. Size it down a little bit, then go to our selection tool and then just realign this here. Now, one other thing that you can do is you can create guides inside After Effects. So with the composition window open, just kind of click out into a blank area, and then hit Command or Control R, and that'll bring up guides and rulers. So what you can do here, and you'll notice, let's see, if we grab our zoom tool and we'll click one more time to zoom in, grab our hand tool. You can actually click and drag out guides. If you go to your selection tool, you click and drag out from the center of that ruler there, you'll notice that we have a nice guide coming in. That way you can really line up your both your name and your title here to the actual guide. And to remove guides, you can just click and drag it back to the ruler side, and then that's gone. All right, so we're way zoomed in here, and one way that you can actually zoom all the way back out is actually changing in the bottom left area your magnification. So right now we're at 400%, but you can change it back to fit, and it'll fit your composition into that window. Now realizing it looks a little too big, so I'm going to click back on Content Creator. Just size this down a little bit. All right, that's looking pretty good. Just checking on the chat and streaming, making sure nothing is broken yet. Everything looks pretty solid. All right, so we added our main text, our title text. Now I think it's on to animation, and this is the fun part. Get to animate. That's why we are in After Effects today. All right, so to animate, there's a lot of different things that you can animate inside After Effects. So to animate different layers, what you can do is, for example, if we're on this shape layer, you can untwirl it, and then you'll notice that there's a transform area. When you untwirl transform, you'll notice that there's anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. You can keyframe these by clicking on the little stopwatch tool to the left-hand side of each parameter. So for example here, say if I wanted to actually animate maybe the rectangle in, maybe from the left-hand side. What I would recommend doing is actually going to the endpoint and then make a keyframe, then go back to the beginning and then animate it out of frame. So to do that, I'm going to go and drag my playhead to maybe the 1 second mark. And then I'm going to click a keyframe or the stopwatch next to position. And then when I drag this playhead back, I can change the X value of the actual shape layer, and this will drag it to the side. If you hold down Shift and change the X value, it'll go a little quicker. And now when we play this back, you'll notice that we have it animate in. Now we can fine tune this a little bit. Right now it's just a linear animation, right? It's just kind of zip and then there it is, right? We can actually kind of fine tune these keyframes. So, these little diamonds are the keyframes. What we can do is right click on them and you'll notice an option under keyframe assistance. This is where you can actually add some, where it can ease into the end of the keyframe or maybe out of the beginning keyframe. And that's the difference between ease in and ease out. Ease in eases into the keyframe and ease out comes out of the keyframe. So on the second keyframe here, what we want is to actually ease in. So we'll just go to ease in. And then on this one, we can right click and we can go to keyframe assistant ease out. And when we play this back, you'll notice that it kind of eases in a little bit more at the beginning or at the end. Now we can even fine tune this a little bit more, and this is a little advanced for a beginner's course, but what you can do is go to the graph editor. And what the graph editor does, it kind of showcases the keyframes over time, the animation. So you can actually see the animation is actually being curved. And when you click on this, sorry, I forgot one important thing when animating. Specifically position is you want to break apart the X and the Y. So I'm actually going to redo this. To reset your keyframes, you can just click the stopwatch. But what you can do is right click and go to separate dimensions. And this will actually separate the X and Y. So in this case, we're only animating the X position. So we'll just keyframe it by clicking it again, go over here to the beginning, and we'll animate this off. And same thing, right click, go to easy ease in, and then right click and go easy ease out. And now when we go to the graph editor, you'll see that we have these handlebars here next to the, you have to actually be selected on the X position. You can click on this keyframe and you can hold down Shift and actually drag this to the left, and you'll notice that we kind of have a nice smooth animation happening here. So that looks pretty good, but what about the text? Well, you can animate the text the same way, or you can actually parent it to the shape so it follows it. So to do that, I'm gonna go toggle the graph editor back off. I'm gonna collapse these keyframes by clicking U and U again. What you can do here is you can actually click on the name, and there you notice that there's this pick whip tool. You can actually click and drag this to the shape layer, and you'll notice what happens here. It'll actually follow it in. So when we click play, it actually follows it. That way you don't have to actually animate, your name graphic separately. Now maybe you don't want to do that. Another thing that you can actually do is actually as the lower third comes in, the John the video guy or your name actually gets revealed by the shape. And to do that, you can actually use alpha mats. So what I'm going to do is change the pick whip to none. And instead what I'm actually going to do is click on this layer and go up to edit, duplicate. And I'm going to rename this layer to matte. So I'm just going to hit return on my keyboard. And I'm going to name this name matte. And hit return. And what you can do is drag this layer above the name, and then with the name selected, you can change your target matte to alpha matte. And if you don't see these options, you can click on your toggle switches down below and that'll change it. Now when we play this back, you'll notice that it stays in place, but it's revealed as the shape layer comes in. And the reason this happens is what this text layer is doing is it's reading the opacity of the layer above it. So as this shape comes in, it's reading, basically over here, it's non-existent, but over here it is existent. So that's kind of what alpha mats do. It's reading the opacity of the layer above it. Since right now you can see the text layer is actually there, it's just not visible because this shape layer that it's above it that it's reading isn't over it. And keep in mind we duplicated that shape layer. So it's the same, animation. If we just click U to bring up our keyframes here, it's the same thing. It's just being keyframed and being used as a mat per se for the name. So that's one cool way that you can animate lower thirds is by using alpha mats or the pick whip tool, either way. All right, so what about the bottom graphic? So we have our bottom where it says content creator. What we can do, we can use the pick whip method. So we can click on our content creator. We'll drag our pick whip tool to that layer. That way, when we click on the shape layer, we click P, it will actually follow it, right? I'll just undo that. So same thing here. What we can do is we can right click and we can click separate dimensions. That'll separate the X and the Y. And one cool thing you can do is maybe John the video guy or the name comes in and then the actual title of the person comes in afterwards. And to do that, what you can do is go to the 1 second mark. You can click and drag the edges of these layers here to actually start at that point in time. And furthermore, you can actually take these layers and move them down below underneath the name graphic. And what you can do is actually animate down. So right now, this is the resting area, but say maybe we can take it and maybe animate so it kind of comes underneath it. So to do that, what we'll do is go to the 2 second mark. We'll click on our shape layer. We'll click this time on the Y position since we're animating the Y position on the stopwatch. Go back to the beginning and we'll just change the value up. So it's kind of right about there. So now when we click play, you notice it kind of reveals itself. You can see just by stacking and changing the order of the layers and the time the layers are visible in the composition or in the timeline, you can create some very unique, magical effects here. The magic of lower thirds. And we'll do the same thing. We'll ease in and we'll ease out on these keyframes. Go back to the graph editor, click on this. That looks pretty good. So that is how to animate in on a lower third. All right, so now that we animated in, let's talk about maybe some effects that we can add to this lower third. One cool lower third effect that you can use is light sweep. And this is very common in lower thirds if you watch the news or different things. I feel like this is the lower third effect to use on pretty much everything. But to add an effect, what you can do is click on a layer, go up to effect, generate light sweep. And you notice that a light sweep will be generated. If we toggle the direction, there we go. Now we can see it. All right, and you can play with the width of it. You can play with the center. So, for example, you can animate it so that, maybe it starts to the left. You can change, toggle the center and then maybe out maybe 8 seconds or so. It kind of finishes to the right side. There we go. I'm always nervous doing these live streams because I'm never sure how much my computer can handle sometimes. But that's a pretty cool effect, and you can play with the width and the settings, the different intensity of it. You can make it subtle, not subtle. The edge thickness, you can bring down the edge or bring up the edge. Really depends on, your own personal preference here. I kind of like the wide sweeps that are kind of like, not that noticeable, but it is kind of noticeable. Kind of like something like that. That looks nice. And maybe we move up the timing. So to go to your keyframes, you can click on the layer, click U, and that'll bring up your keyframes, and you can kind of marquee and select these keyframes here. Just move them over a little bit. It looks nice, very subtle. Adds just a little bit of something to it. Now you'll notice at the very beginning here, as it animates in, you can kind of see on the left side here that light sweep. So I'm just going to go to that keyframe, move it a little bit more to the left. That way it's not as noticeable. That looks pretty good. Cool. So we got a nice effect, and there's lots of effects. And you notice that I went up to the effect menu. This is the same, literally the same exact menu as it is to the right. So if you go to the right hand side, you can go to effects, and it's the same exact menu here. One other cool effect, just to showcase, dragging an effect from the right to the left, is fill. So you can search for an effect over here, which is very helpful. If you can't find, one of the big things with the effect window in general is you can't, unless you know exactly the subcategory that, since I knew light sweep was under the generate submenu, if you don't know where it is, I do recommend using the effects and presets window. That way you can just type it in, light sweep, and it will auto-populate, and bring it up for you. But one other cool effect that you can use is fill. So if you type in FILL, this will change the color of a layer. So say if you wanted to, click and drag fill to maybe this bottom layer, it'll change the actual color of it. Now you can actually, change the color of the rectangle itself, but this is just another way that you can change the color of something. You can click on the color. Maybe you want to do, maybe a gray color instead. You can do like off gray and do something like that. Another cool effect that you can use for lower thirds is drop shadow. So you can type in drop shadow, add a drop shadow to the layer, change the different settings. There's tons of layers in here, effects in here. So it's just a matter of playing with it over time and seeing, what works for you. And say if you like a layer from one layer and you want to paste it to another layer, what you can do is just click on one of the effects, hit Command or Control C, and then go to the other layer and hit Command or Control V. I'll just paste it. So now we got a drop shadow on the lower third with a light sweep that's animated. And, very similar to the light sweep, you can animate the different properties in the drop shadow, or really any of these parameters here, the shape, width, opacity, the direction, anything can really be animated that where you see the little, stopwatch at. All right, so we added effects, we designed our lower third, animated it in. Now let's see a different way that we can animate it out. And the next thing I'll be covering is what's called null objects. So what a null object is inside After Effects is it's just kind of like it's just an invisible layer that that has data in it essentially, and very similar to how you saw me pick whip the content creator tool to this shape layer. You can do the same thing with null objects, and that's in lower thirds. That's what I primarily use null objects for. So enough talking about null objects, let's actually apply one. So to actually get to a null object where you want to go is up to layer, new, null object. And you'll get a new null object, and you can see it's displayed here in the center. The anchor point, which is that little guy right in the center there, is dead center into the composition. And you can see it's just a square and it's invisible. But if we untwirl it in the layers panel, or sorry, in the timeline panel, you can see it has the same properties as any other layer. And you can scale it up, you can scale it down, right? So it has the same parameters, but the key here is what you can do with it. Since it's an invisible layer that has those parameters in it, you can actually link the other layers to that layer and animate everything together. And that's really where null objects shine. Because, for example, here we have, I'm just going to untwirl this. All of these layers are animated and very complex. So if we want to animate all of this out together, instead of going in here and, animating this out and then this out and then, the name out, you can just pick whip everything to the null object and have that animate everything out. So we're going to do that here. First, I'm just going to rename the null object. I'm going to hit return. And I usually name it something that, is what it is. And so animate out. And what you can do is just pick whip basically everything to this animate out layer. So I'm going to pick whip the matte. So I'm just going to click and drag the pick whip tool to that. Gonna pick whip tool the text layer to the animate out. Now this is important. The content creator, that's going to follow the shape layer. And the shape layer, I'm going to pick whip to the animate out. So you can see kind of how the parent-child of the pick whip works is the content creator is following the shape layer, but now the shape layer is following the null object. So check this out. If we hit P on our keyboard and we move the null object, everything moves to the null object. So you can kind of see how that works. That's pretty cool, isn't it? So you can have several null objects and everything is pick whipped together. And that's essentially what null objects are. You have complete control over, everything. You can animate everything all at once instead of trying to animate everything individually. All right, so let's animate this. So we'll just go to the end. Drag this guy up here. Go to maybe about 9 seconds or so. A good rule of thumb for designing lower thirds is it should be up there for enough time to read it twice slowly. So John the video guy, content creator. So maybe around 7.5. I'll give it 8 seconds. Around here, maybe we should animate it off. So that's enough time to leave it on the screen and then pull it away. So to do that, I'm just going to click on this position, right click on it, and then go to separate dimensions. And maybe we animate it down, so it kind of drops down. We'll click the stopwatch next to the Y position, go out to maybe 9 seconds or so, and we'll just click and drag this up to animate out. And then when we play this back, you'll notice that it animates out all together. So it's one simple way to just animate everything out together. And what we can do, we can ease out on this animation. And this is, you'll notice at the beginning, when we first animated it, I animated ease in to kind of smooth in. This one, we want to really smooth out. So what we're going to do is right click, go to keyframe assistance, easy ease out. And then when we click on graph editor, what we can do is really stretch out this handlebar, and you'll notice kind of slowly starts and then it kind of zooms out here. It's a little fast. I'm going to go back and unselect that and then maybe move this keyframe out a little bit. So the animate out is about a second and a half or so. There we go. That looks pretty good. So it's very subtle, but it's there. You can tell it's easing out of the keyframe. So it starts slow and then it kind of picks up speed at the end of the animation. So yeah, that's how to design a lower third in After Effects. One other thing that you can do, I don't really recommend it for lower thirds too much, since it's it's not something you maybe want to do a lot in lower thirds, but you can add motion blur. And to do that, I'll just go back to toggle switches and transparency. You'll notice that there's this little motion blur button. What you can do is just kind of click and drag down to select it for all layers. And when you play this back, you'll notice, say if we zoom in here, it's actually adding some artificial blur as the lower third animates in. And if we uncheck that, you'll notice that it's just a solid line as it kind of animates in. So it's really personal preference. I usually don't do it. Since motion blur, really, if you think about it, it's more for live action shots, maybe like visual effects. Not so much lower thirds, but it's there if you want to add it. And kind of blend pixels together. That's one way. Another thing I'll cover since we have some time here, there's shy layers inside After Effects. So you notice this little shy guy here. What you can do to kind of clean up this timeline a little bit, you can make layers shy and essentially hide them, but they're still there. That way, especially for lower thirds, all you really want to do once it's designed is have the ability to change the name. So what you can do is actually make layers shy. So to make layers shy, what you can do is click on the little shy guy next to the layer of each of the layers you want to make shy. So for example, the null object, we can make that a shy layer. The matte, we can make that a shy layer. And maybe the shape layers, we make a shy layer, and we leave the text layers not shy layers. So when we click that, and then when we enable shy layers for everybody in the composition, we click that button, you'll notice now only the text layers are visible. So that's very helpful if you want to clean up your timeline a little bit. So now, you don't have to worry about trying to select the wrong layer. Only the text layers are visible now, and you can easily change the name and the title of your lower third. That's how shy layers work. It's very helpful to just clean up. You can uncheck and check this little shy guy, and it kind of hides and unhides, the layers inside your composition. So that's very helpful, especially if you're designing something complex with a lot of moving parts. And you only want to display, change the text. This is where you go to do that. So that's shy layers. All right, so let's talk about exporting. So as I talked about at the beginning of the stream, there's that transparency grid. And for lower thirds specifically, what you might want to do is preserve the transparency and then actually export it so that you can put it over videos. So just to confirm again, if you click and unclick that transparency button, it is indeed transparent. But to actually animate this out with transparency, there's a few export settings that you want to keep in mind as you actually render this out. And, you can put it over, footage of me, footage of, your subject. That way you have it and you can use it for your, projects. So to animate out of After Effects, where you want to go with the actual timeline selected here, where you want to go is up to composition, add to render queue. And this will actually add it to the render queue. And this is essentially the dialog box where you go to render out, your different compositions. And in here, there's different render settings. Under best settings, just make sure when you click that, make sure quality is best, resolution full, that proxies aren't on. We didn't cover proxies in this live stream, but proxies are, search it. There's a lot of good material on how to make proxies, but you can use them, especially if you're working with really high res compositions. But just make sure that's off. Everything looks good. If it looks like this, you should be good. Click OK. The settings that you want to change are actually under the output module. So when you click next to output module, click on lossless. The format I recommend is QuickTime. So just be sure you're on QuickTime here. And the key here is to change the channels. So you'll notice that there's RGB, but when you click on the drop down, there's alpha and RGB alpha. What you want for lower thirds specifically is RGB plus alpha. And this will not only export the actual RGB colors, the actual lower third itself, but it'll retain that transparency data. That way you can actually use it and put it over different people or subjects. So just be sure that RGB plus alpha is turned on. Then under format options, you can actually change the actual codec. One of the best codecs that I recommend for lower thirds specifically is Apple ProRes 4444. That's a really high resolution codec that you can use for your lower third projects. But if not, animation is always another good option. All right, I'm gonna click OK. All the other settings are fine. I would just click OK, and then output 2, just click next to that, and this will output. You can choose your location if you want to save it on a hard drive, or you're working somewhere. Just choose where you want to save it. You can change the name of it. In this case, I'm just gonna put it in my downloads folder for now, and then click save. And then where you want to go is to the right here. You'll notice a render button. Now you can queue it in Adobe Media Encoder. To be honest, it's a little faster if you just stay in After Effects. From personal experience, if you just render straight out of After Effects, it's a little faster because it has to kick it to Adobe Media Encoder and then render it out. So if you want a quicker export, I would just render it straight out of After Effects. So you just click the render button and you'll notice that it will render out. A little render bar, we can see our animation. And there we go. We got our rendered animation. We go to our Finder, Downloads folder. We can see that we have a file. So that is the lower third we created today, guys. Hopefully you learned something from this live stream. But that is basically my process for creating pretty much any lower thirds. There's a lot of different things you can do in After Effects, but this is just kind of a teaser to kind of show you guys, a little bit of how to work with the controls, especially for lower third graphics. Just explore, have fun. After Effects, after all, it is just save this to my downloads folder. It is, an art form, but you can get very creative with all the tools and stuff inside After Effects. But that's essentially what I wanted to go over today. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys. All right, well, take care. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section. This live stream will be available to replay at really any time. So if you want to go back and review and see the different steps that I showed along the way, feel free to rewatch it as many times as you want. And I will be monitoring the questions that come in if you guys have questions about designing lower thirds inside After Effects. But that pretty much wraps it up for this live stream for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you guys next time.